but it's mainly about colour. The reason why the far right are targeting Muslims today is not because they like Sikhs.
And you said that all Pakistanis are inbred, and you looked at me and said, don't be offended. I'm not even Pakistani. That's disrespectful, sir. And you said that all Pakistanis are inbred, and you looked at me and said, don't be offended. I'm not even Pakistani. That's disrespectful, sir.
Can it have anything to do with the already bad blood of between Sikhs and Muslims?
All right, let me get. I'm going to have to give you a bit of a history here, just for 2 minutes. Now, for 800 years, North India, has been conquered by the Islamic conquest. So the same way that black people might have a big issue with white people, yeah, Asian people, Hindus and Sikhs do have a problem with Islam in a way, because Islam coming to India and they killed around 150 million people over 800-year period. For Sikhs, we've been battling Mughal or Islamic oppression for like 400 years. And when we come to the UK, obviously partition as well. Remember during partition, 1 million people died on both sides. Yeah, so there is some blood, but I'm not going to lie about that.
To try to make the point that this is not just about colour, but it's mainly about colour. The reason why the far right are targeting Muslims today is not because they like Sikhs. It's not because they like Hindus. It's not because they like Afro-Caribbean people any more than they did before. They have fastened upon Muslims as a target because Islamophobia has become the most virulent of the strains of racism in this period. Though of course there have been many other periods in which other faiths and colours were on the receiving end of this. And how have they alighted on this? We in the anti-war movement said from the beginning, if you go around the world invading and occupying Muslim countries, if you go to war with Muslims abroad, you will end up making war against Muslims at home. Ineluctably, you will be required to, because you cannot pump the population full of enmity and anger and suspicion against Muslims abroad, but somehow exempt the 2 million Muslims in your midst. As Ismail Patel put it, who is going to make the judgment that the Muslim A is an extremist whilst Muslim B is all right? Who's going to make that judgment? The Daily Star? Richard Desmond? The EDL? These people are against all Muslims because they're against all people of colour and all immigrants in this country. Because they are, in the case of the EDL, at least their leaders, are motivated by the same fascistic germ that was referred to by the earlier contributor from the Jewish community.
So we have a different history than you with the Muslims. Like the way you may have a problem with white people, Sikhs and Hindus do have a bit of a problem with Muslim people.
White people. See, me, I don't think in that. I don't think in those type of dimensions, bro. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you, yeah. If there's an issue to address, we attack it openly and honestly, yeah. But I'm not on trying to use a label to drive home an agenda. So now, for instance, yeah, you historically have an issue with Muslims and Islam. When you come over here, you still see the same type of dynamics playing out, Sikh versus Muslim. So you guys have this, you lot have this dynamic of I don't want to say hatred, but there's a strong enmity, rivalry, a deep enmity between you.
Quite a lot of crossover between the two, isn't there? Between the BNP and the EDL, there's quite a lot of crossover.
Well, I mean, the reality of the situation is the type of narratives that these parties are offering around Islam and around immigration are very similar. Jamie's study has shown that EDL supporters are not just concerned about Islam; they're concerned about immigration more generally.
I think a lot of people are concerned about immigration.
For as long as I have been alive, migration, the use of the word immigrant and immigration in the political narrative has been a euphemism for race and the other. That's where we start. The other thing to say about immigration, that actually before the Brexit vote, Labour Party colleagues were telling me, oh, you know, if people are anti-Eastern European migrants, that isn't racist because they're white. How could it possibly be racism? And I had to remind them that if you go back to the Victorian era and you see the way the Irish were spoken about, the way the Irish were discriminated against, the way the commentary on the Irish was a racialised commentary, if you see the cartoons in newspapers and magazines of the time which depicted the Irish as apes, the point is you don't have to be non-white to be subject to a racialised attack and a racialised narrative. And I can assure all of you that if you go home and you Google some of the things that were said about the Irish in the Victorian era, they now say exactly the same about Eastern Europeans. That anti-immigrant narrative doesn't alter from century to century. So let's be clear. Any talk about immigration is actually a euphemism for race and the other. And that applies as much if you're talking about Eastern European migrants, if you're talking about migrants from West Africa or South Asia. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say, and it's perhaps a slightly lighter thing, but it's important, I represent a constituency which has immigrants from everywhere, from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from Israel, from Vietnam, from South Asia, from Eastern Europe. And I'm afraid it's a characteristic of immigrants that the second to last group of immigrants to enter the country feel they have license to be negative about the latest group. So many Irish people weren't so pleasant about West Indians, many West Indians weren't so pleasant about West Africans, and so on and so on. And I say this not to make a frivolous point, but anti-immigrant forces will stand up and say, oh, we heard, you know, a Jamaican say this, or we heard an Irish person say that. The fact that it is almost a rite of passage for immigrant groups that are a little further along the road to turn and adopt an anti-immigrant narrative to the newest immigrant groups doesn't mean that the anti-immigrant narrative isn't a racialised narrative.